Good afternoon, everyone. So, this week our topic is the transformation of the American state, and we're covering two really big topics, the New Deal and the home front during World War II. The thing that ties these two topics together is that they represent how the American state, also known as the federal government, how it was fundamentally transformed during the 1930s and early 1940s. As we've seen, ever since the Civil War, the power and the size of the federal government has been incrementally increasing, mainly in response to the various crises that the nation has to deal with. The crisis of the Civil War and the problem of Reconstruction represented a sizable shift toward increasing the size and power of the federal government as legislation was passed to promote mobilization for the war, to promote industrialization, westward expansion. And the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, greatly increased what the federal government was allowed to do, namely, regulate the actions of state governments when it came to the rights of citizens. As we have seen, the Supreme Court often tried to put limits on that power, but it still represented a fundamental shift in the concept of federalism. As the United States was confronting the economic and social problems that were caused by industrialization, the role of the federal government in tackling those problems increased again during the Progressive Era. For the first time in American history, it seemed as though many Americans were changing their attitudes about what the government can and should do with regard to regulating the economy to prevent some of the excesses of modern industrial capitalism. Again, these changes weren't radical and were often blocked by the courts, but attitudes were shifting nonetheless. But it's this constant tug of war, back and forth between those who believe that the federal government has a bigger role to play and those who wanted to keep limits on the size and the scope of the federal government. That brings us to the Great Depression, which, as we have seen, was really an existential crisis, the likes of which had not been seen before. There had been severe downturns, severe economic depressions before in American history, but the Great Depression was something else entirely. Much more severe, longer lasting than anything Americans had faced up to this point. When the Depression hit, the administration in power argued that the problem could be solved by private enterprise and charities and by individual states, and that there wasn't much that the federal government could do beyond raising tariffs, which ended up only making the problem worse, and by giving bailouts to banks and cutting taxes. Hoover argued that anything greater would go against American self reliance and independence and undermine the national character. As we saw on last Friday, by 1932, that view had become deeply unpopular, and Americans were crying out to their government for help. So that brings us to our topic today. We're going to look at how two big crises, the Great Depression and a Second World War, prompted a transformation in the role of the federal government. So, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933, the United States was at the very bottom of the worst depression in its history. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Farmers were in deep trouble. Prices had fallen by 60%. Industrial production had fallen by more than half since 1929. 2 million people were homeless. By the evening of his inauguration, 32 out of the 48 states, as well as the District of Columbia, had closed their banks. The New York Federal Reserve Bank was unable to open the next morning because huge sums had been withdrawn by panicky customers in the previous days. So Roosevelt comes in, beginning with his inauguration address. Roosevelt blames the economic crisis on bankers and financiers and on the quest for profit above all else and the self-interested basis of capitalism. I'm going to play for you a little excerpt from his inaugural address. This is the most famous sort of part of FDR's inaugural.
This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly stating conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
So imagine living during the time of the Depression and hearing those words from your newly inaugurated president. This kind of natural air of confidence and optimism that he projected did a lot to try to reassure the nation. His inauguration was occurring in the midst of this bank panic, and that is kind of the backdrop for these famous words that he says, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The very next day, FDR declares there's going to be a bank holiday. He announces a plan to allow banks to reopen. He drafts new banking legislation, which provides for government supervision and aid to the banks. Strong banks would be reopened with federal support. Weak ones would be closed. Those who were struggling would be given loans. He gets Congress to pass a piece of legislation known as the Glass-Steagall Act, which prevents banks from buying and selling stocks. And until it was repealed in the 1990s, it barred many of the irresponsible practices that had led to the stock market crash in the first place. He also establishes the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is a government system insuring your bank account. And it takes the U.S. off the gold. He takes the U.S. off the gold standard in order to be able to issue more money to stimulate the economy. Historians have categorized Roosevelt's program as relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, of course, was urgently needed by tens of millions of unemployed Americans. Recovery meant getting the economy running again, getting things back to normal. Reform meant long-term fixes of what was wrong, especially with the financial and banking systems. So Roosevelt's first 100 days in office concentrated on the first part of that strategy, immediate relief. From March 9th to June 16th, he sends Congress a record number of bills, all of which passed pretty easily. He saw the Depression mainly, or at least in part, a matter of confidence, caused partly by people no longer spending or investing because they were afraid. And so therefore he set out to restore the public's confidence through this series of dramatic gestures. Now, at the time, such proposals and measures seemed pretty radical, but it's actually remarkable how conservative Roosevelt's plan was. He could have come in and said, okay, we're nationalizing the banks. But instead, he threw the government's resources behind them. He allowed them to remain privatized, but regulated. So he's out to reform and restore the American economic system. He's not out to change it drastically, despite what many of his critics alleged. I'm not going to concentrate too much on all the individual pieces of the New Deal. You can read all about the agencies and the programs FDR established in your textbook, and it gets really, really tedious when you have to go and remember all of those acronyms. What you should remember is that Roosevelt doesn't come into office with a comprehensive plan. The New Deal was really an experiment. FDR and his advisors were kind of throwing whatever they can at the problem and seeing what works and what didn't. Some of the programs and agencies worked, and some not so much. Some of these agencies would be dissolved or declared unconstitutional. But what was more important is that FDR was doing something. He was using the power of the federal government to tackle this massive nationwide problem. And And this really helped to boost the people's confidence. And it also represented a massive expansion in the role of the federal government. The programs that were implemented between 1933 and 1935 are often referred to by historians as the first New Deal. These programs mainly concentrated on emergency measures and immediate relief programs. It did not bring the United States out of the Depression, but it did end up boosting America's spirits quite a bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more well-known programs of the New Deal, and some of the programs that might have kind of a lasting impact. The New Deal was very successful in providing economic relief for millions of unemployed and destitute Americans. In 1933, Roosevelt brought in an advisor named Harry Hopkins to run the Reconstruction Finance Corporation relief program. He went straight to work, and famously, he spent more than $5 million in less than 2 hours. By the end of 1933, he had distributed money to nearly a sixth of the American people. This allowed people to avoid starvation and stay out of the breadlines. One of the more popular programs of the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a program that enrolled young men and sent them to work on the nation's public lands, cutting trails, building bridges, planting trees, paving roads. More than 2 million people served in the CCC. Hopkins argued that government should put the jobless to work, not just to encourage people to build back their self-respect, but to enable them to earn enough to buy consumer goods, and that would stimulate the entire economy. The Works Progress Administration was the largest and the most comprehensive New Deal agency. It employed millions of people and affected just about every part of the country, especially rural and western mountain populations. It was created in May of 1935, and it provided jobs and income to the unemployed during the Great Depression. The program built a lot of public buildings, projects, and roads. It operated arts, drama, media, literacy projects. It fed children. It redistributed food and clothing and housing until it was closed down by Congress and during World War II. The various programs of the WPA added up to the largest employment base of the country. It was the largest cluster of government employment opportunities in most places. Anybody who needed a job could become eligible for most of the jobs. Hourly wages tended to be the prevailing wages in the area. The rules said that workers could not work more than 30 hours a week, but a lot of projects included months living in the field with workers eating and sleeping on work sites. Before 1940, they also did some training as well, teaching people new skills. And about 75% of what the WPA did was creating new public facilities and infrastructure, building highways, public buildings, airports, dams, city halls, libraries, parks. The WPA built 650,000 miles of roads, 78,000 bridges, 125,000 buildings, 700 miles of airport runways. 7% of the budget was allocated to arts projects. They took in unemployed, white collar workers, artists, musicians, actors, writers in projects like the Federal Theater Project and the Federal Writers Project. One of the things that the Federal Writers Project conducted was interviews with formerly enslaved people. So they sent writers down to the South to conduct these interviews. And a lot of our knowledge about what it was like to live under slavery comes from these interviews that were done because of the WPA. The WPA was a very popular program, but it failed to overcome the Depression. The greatest problem was that these programs were never sufficiently funded. The WPA never employed more than 3 million out of the 10 million Americans who were out of work at the time. And wages tended to be very low, so this idea that it could prime the economy by increasing consumer purchasing power never really ended up to materializing. In 1935, the focus began to shift from recovery and relief to reform. Roosevelt was responding to pressures from organized groups like corporations and labor unions and farm organizations. And the continuing depression and the continued high unemployment built some more pressure for taking more sweeping changes. Another one of the very popular programs of the and more enduring programs of the WPA, or the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, was the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt signed the act creating the TVA on May 18th, 1933, and it actually still exists today. Even by Depression era standards, the Tennessee Valley, which you can see a map of where it is, today, some of the areas, very heavily hit by Hurricane Helene, Asheville, North Carolina, for example, is along the Tennessee Valley. It was in pretty bad shape in 1933. 30% of the population was infected by malaria. The income in the region was only about $600 per year. Some families were surviving on as little as $100 a year. A lot of the land had been farmed for a really, really long time, and so the soil had become eroded and depleted. And because of that, the farms crop yields on these farms were falling, and farm incomes were falling along with it. The best lumber in the area had also been cut, and another 10% of forests in the region were being burnt every year. So the TVA was coming in. It was intended to provide electricity to the Tennessee River Valley, which was one of the poorest places in the country. They were designed to kind of modernize the region, and bringing in a lot of experts and the new technology to combat some of these problems that the region was facing. The TVA developed fertilizers. They taught farmers how to increase their crop yields and help to replant forests. They improved the environment, the habitat for fish and wildlife, and they brought in electrification. Electric lights, modern appliances would make life easier for the people there and make farms more productive. And it would also draw industry into the region and provide desperately needed jobs. So the TVA was really kind of one of the more enduring and popular programs of the New Deal. And it's an example of, kind of what the New Deal did, really trying to kind of, they replicated this in other poor regions of the country as well. By 1935, as I mentioned, Roosevelt was ready to support a series of reform measures designed not just to alleviate the suffering of the Depression, but to reform the economy so that the Depression could never happen again. Roosevelt was in a good position at this point to get these measures passed. Democrats were stronger in Congress. A lot of them were, pushing for more reforms, more sweeping federal programs. The most significant reform of 1935, and maybe of the entire New Deal, was the Social Security Act. There were three major parts to it. It provided for pensions for the elderly, financed by a tax on employers and workers. And it also set up a state system of unemployment compensation on a federal and state basis. And it directed federal grants to the states for welfare payments for disabled people, for the poor, for dependent children. The Social Security Act was criticized by both the right and the left. Conservatives, of course, were horrified about this. They said this is, it's going to, kind of mean that the traditional American reliance on self-help and individualism is now gone. Now the government is paying people. This is terrible. Those on the left argued that Social Security didn't go far enough. These old age pensions tended to be pretty small, and not everyone was covered. If you look at this poster here, which talks about who is eligible, it says everyone working for salary or wages, with only a few exceptions, such as agriculture, domestic service, or government work. So farmers, domestic servants were not eligible for Social Security, at least not initially. Everyone paid into Social Security, regardless of their income or their economic status, at the same rate. So there was no kind of, differentiation based upon your wealth, your income. Uh, People argued that it took out of circulation money that was needed to stimulate the economy, and the unemployment system didn't apply to those who were already out of work, only those who would lose jobs in the future. Uh, Roosevelt was pragmatic. He knew that passing anything more sweeping than this was going to be difficult. In fact, he wanted to add on to the Social Security Act a health care insurance system, but he knew that that would be, not he wouldn't be able to get that passed through. He recognized that this establishing this system of federal welfare went against some deeply rooted convictions of self-reliance and individualism. And that's one of the reasons why he insisted that people were actually paying for their pensions, because he wanted to give the American public a vested interest in it. He wanted people to feel as though they had earned their pensions. So with Social Security, you get a little bit of money taken out of your paycheck every month, and then at some point when you were ready to retire, you will get that money back. What was really successful about Social Security was the precedent it set. It established a pattern of the federal government taking responsibility to provide for people who could not provide for themselves, for the elderly, for the disabled, for the unemployed, for women and children who, sort of were unable to work. And so it really is creating this kind of first real federal social safety net. The other really revolutionary aspect of what sometimes is called the Second New Deal is labor legislation. And that was passed with the Wagner Act in 1935. The Wagner Act created the National Labor Relations Board, which allowed unions to collectively bargain with the support of the federal government. It outlawed union busting tactics. It said that when a majority of workers voted for a union to represent them, the company then had to negotiate with the union. And so this enabled labor unions to recruit large numbers of workers throughout the country. As you can see here with this advertisement, it's appealing, this is the United Automobile Workers, appealing to workers at the Ford plants and saying, now is the time to organize. The Wagner bill is behind you. Now get behind yourselves. So the federal government is backing up unions here. At the time Congress passed the Wagner Act, the country had just gone through a number of strikes. And the act was passed in order to divert those potentially very violent conflicts into more manageable channels by giving workers the legal right to form unions and to bargain, and creating an administration to determine, sort of whether people wanted to unionize. It legalized the right to strike. It barred employers from firing workers for engaging in union activities. It made sort of the management decisions subjected to scrutiny by the federal government. And it said that when an employer when workers at a company decided to unionize, that employer had to negotiate with the union. In the first couple of years of the Wagner Act, a lot of employers simply refused to recognize it as law. The Supreme Court had already struck down a number of other parts of the New Deal on the grounds that they were unconstitutional, that Congress didn't have the authority to pass these kinds of laws. And many unions didn't bother to use the NLRB in the first few years of its passage. It really wasn't until the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Wagner Act in 1937 that it became law in practical terms as well. In 1938, Congress went further, passing a second law, the Fair Labor Standards Act. This aimed to establish both maximum hours and minimum wages. And Roosevelt was kind of able to push this through as well. And it really sets up a system that Congress can build on for the future. So going back to kind of the 1920s and at the beginning of the Great Depression, trade unions had been in a very weak position. Uh, they had, less than 3 million members all around the country. Most of those were in skilled unions, like the American Federation of Labor. Basic industries like the steel industry, the automobile industry were unorganized. And most unskilled workers had very poor wages, very poor working conditions. So these two pieces of legislation, the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, really put the power of the federal government behind unionization. And we see by the end of the 1930s a new union coming on the scene, the Congress of Industrial Organization. This was led by John Lewis, who was a very ambitious union leader. He ends up sort of trying to use the Wagner Act to unionize the auto and steel industry. And he's able to do just that by 1937. He's able to unionize the steel industry. He meets with a little bit more resistance in the auto industry, but by the end of the 1930s, the CIO had 5 million members. And for the first time, we have a national union unionizing unskilled as well as skilled workers. So we have this great sort of growth in the power of unions during the period, and that partly because of the role that the federal government was now taking. The New Deal reaches its high point in 1936. Roosevelt, this is a re-election year, presidential election year. Roosevelt is overwhelmingly reelected, and he gets a stronger Democratic majority in Congress during that year as well. He's facing some challenges from both the right and the left in 1936. And so he really runs on his record of, reform, and he attacks the wealthy and corporations. He promises further reforms. His Republican opponent, Alf Landon, was a pretty moderate candidate and fairly bland. He criticized the New Deal, but he didn't really campaign for repealing some of the more popular programs that the New Deal had put into place. And so FDR is able, during the campaign, to put together a political coalition that is going to dominate American politics for the next 30 years. He is able to hold on to the traditionally Democratic South, but he also is very easily carrying the urban areas, the cities, and he gets strong support from labor, strong support from different ethnic groups, and strong support from African Americans. And of course, people who were impoverished, which in the Depression years included a lot of people who had been formerly middle class. They become attached to the Democratic Party as well. So it really is an enduring political coalition that he puts together. So FDR, flushed with his victory in 1936, he turns now to eliminating what he sees as the last obstacle to his agenda, which is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, of course, had blocked several of FDR's first-term programs on the grounds that they were unconstitutional. And he hadn't been able to appoint any new justices to the Supreme Court during his first term. It didn't look like any of them were willing to retire anytime soon. And for 30 years, the Supreme Court had been interpreting the Constitution, interpreting the 14th Amendment, with this idea of liberty of contract, which we've talked about, that was very hostile to New Deal legislation. So he really saw the court's actions as overstepping their authority and kind of frustrating what he was trying to do to combat the Great Depression. He thought that these justices were legislating from the bench, that they were reading into the Constitution things that were not there. And so he came up with this idea that he was going to add members to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court in the Constitution doesn't say anything about how many, people need to be on the Supreme Court. It just says that there will be a Supreme Court. It doesn't say how many justices need to be there. So what Roosevelt was trying to do was technically within the bounds of the Constitution. But a lot of people at the time saw it as an overreach of presidential power. he gets a lot of criticism from Congress, both from Republicans, of course, who are accusing him of packing the court with his supporters, but also Democrats are opposed to this. They see this as Roosevelt going too far. He lost the battle in Congress, but he ends up kind of winning the war to change the judicial philosophy of the Supreme Court. But it ends up costing FDR some political capital, and some of his opponents become really emboldened at this point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the limitations of the New Deal. Even though FDR had passed Social Security in 1935, this legislation didn't cover some of the nation's poorest: farmers, domestic laborers. These were people who the Depression had hit particularly hard because economic collapse had combined with an environmental disaster. Farmers in the middle of the country were facing drought on an unprecedented scale because mechanized agriculture had turned the soil into sand, and it had killed grasses that prevented erosion. And combined with very strong winds that blow across the Great Plains, this meant you got these huge dust storms like the ones you can see in the photo on the bottom here, where literally whole houses and towns are buried under dust. More than 1 million farmers get displaced by the Dust Bowl between 1935 and 1940. It tended to be the poorest farmers who ended up not benefiting the most from these New Deal programs. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers did not really reap the benefits of the New Deal. And this policy of encouraging landowners not to grow crops meant that thousands of people were evicted. So combined with the Dust Bowl, this meant that some of the nation's poorest citizens were made worse off, not better off, by the New Deal. And so, sort of, it really was a difficult thing for farmers and some of the most poorest Americans. There were really not very many significant gains in the status of women during the 1930s. There wasn't a lot of concern with extending the rights of women during the midst of the Depression. Employers tended to discriminate in favor of men when they were cutting jobs and laying off people. Working women got accused of taking jobs that might otherwise be done by unemployed men. And federal regulations prohibited more than one member of a family from working in any one of the federal positions. And it really was the sentiment that most Americans, 82% in one poll, disapproved of married women working. So a lot of the women who worked during the 1930s tended to be single or tended to be the sole supporters of their family. Women's wages were lower than those of men. Their unemployment rate tended to be higher. A lot of women were working in industries that were not covered by Social Security or by labor reform acts. One area of advancement came within government, though. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, set an example, a model of activism for millions of American women. She was extremely popular, beloved figure, and very, very active. She was probably the most active First Lady up to this point in American history. Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, became the first female cabinet member. Women got appointed by the Roosevelt administration as ambassadors and judges. Women became elected to office in larger numbers during the 1930s. But on the whole, the status of women really didn't improve all that much. The New Deal was maybe least effective when it came to helping people of color. The New Deal did very little for Mexican Americans who, as we talked about last week, were engaged primarily in agricultural labor. Their wages fell just as, sort of non-Mexican Americans did. And many of them were encouraged to leave the United States. During the 1930s, there was a sort of a cohesive program designed to deport a lot of Mexican Americans. Even people who were American citizens were deported and sent back to Mexico. And overall, the pattern was really one of economic hardship and not a lot of federal assistance. Native Americans did fare slightly better under the New Deal. Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, which was designed to kind of alleviate some of the earlier programs, things like the Dawes Act, which we saw in the late 19th century, was designed to kind of destroy tribal unity. The Indian Reorganization Act was designed to stress tribal unity and tribal autonomy and give back some control to Native Americans over their own affairs. They still remain some of the most impoverished citizens in America, however. The Great Depression hit African Americans particularly hard. Sharecroppers, tenant farmers really couldn't make enough selling their crop to sustain their families. African Americans tended to be fired more at a higher rate than white Americans were. More than 50% of Black people living in cities were unemployed by 1933. And of course, hard times tend to sharpen racial prejudice. The New Deal helped Black Americans survive the Depression, but it never really tried to confront the racial injustices that were built into these federal relief programs. Because so many of the programs were interpreted and administered by the states, African Americans in the South received smaller relief payments. They were, fired, as this cartoon suggests, under the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. Was allowed, company, it suggests, was allowed to, discriminate against Black workers. Despite this rather sort of bleak record, African Americans supported Roosevelt overwhelmingly. During the 1930s, they abandoned their historic ties to the Republican Party and shifted over to supporting the Democratic Party. And this is partly in response to Roosevelt's appointment of African Americans to high-ranking government positions. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, very publicly spoke out against racial discrimination. The WPA had a colorblind hiring policy, and even though this is a very uneven record, Roosevelt had really done more for African Americans than any other president had since Abraham Lincoln. And so they end up supporting Roosevelt and the Democrats overwhelmingly, and have continued to do so up to today. So to kind of sum up the New Deal, we have some lasting achievements, obviously, Social Security, the Wagner Act, the public works projects that were created by the New Deal, the political realignment that was established in the 1930s, creating the New Deal coalition. Those were some of the lasting achievements. The limitations, though, was that the New Deal really didn't end the Depression. It did not really fundamentally alter the economic system. And there was not as much done for those without strong political clout as you might have hoped for. So the New Deal was definitely a huge reorganization and transformation in the power of the federal government. And what we're going to see is kind of that continuing as we move into the World War II era. Of course, probably the single biggest effect of the United States entering World War II is that the war ends the Great Depression. Prior to the United States entering the war, the economy had been pretty stagnant, as you can see in this chart demonstrating levels of unemployment. All the way up to 1940, unemployment never falls below 15%. But even before the United States enters the war officially, it begins to fall because American industry is ramping up in preparation for our official entry into the war. And by 1942, now that America is officially fighting, we're back to pre-Depression era levels. And you can really see that in this photo here, which shows this chalkboard outside a factory listing all of the jobs that they need to fill. As you might imagine, this was welcome relief to all the workers who were still unemployed. A lot of these jobs were located in factories that had been reorganized to produce weapons, vehicles, aircraft, other things for the war effort. Here we see a factory assembly line producing tanks. Before the war, this plant produced Cadillac cars. And these wartime industries were remarkably efficient. By 1944, American factories could produce a ship every single day and an airplane every 5 minutes. The number of government jobs also rose, partly because there was a huge increase in new wartime agencies. The number of federal workers rose from 1 million to 4 million. And a lot of these wartime agencies were designed to regulate the economy. So we see again this huge expansion in the role of the federal government. This process continues and expands during the war. The relationship between government and business also changes due to the war. During the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration and big business had often been at odds, but now both sides realize that they could work together for their mutual benefit. The government also sponsors new scientific research and helps to develop new technologies that not only help to win the war, but that are going to transform American life after the war. Labor unions also benefit from the war. By the end of the war, union membership is up to nearly 15 million Americans, the highest proportion of the total workforce in American history. The war also changes America physically as well. This map clearly shows how American society is becoming militarized during the war. The red dots are airfields, bases, and stations. The green dots are army camps, forts, and posts. And the blue dots, which are concentrated obviously along the coast, are naval bases. And you can see how military activity was very heavily concentrated along the West Coast and then also in the South. But almost every region and state in the country was affected in some way by the war, and a lot of these bases and forts will remain active after the war. There are also, kind of changing ideas about ethnicity and race that the government promotes during the war. The U.S. is fighting against an enemy, Hitler and the Nazis, whose basic ideology of a master race triumphing over and subduing all other peoples seems to be totally at odds with American values. So the war really brings to the forefront, really for the first time in American history, a more pluralistic vision of American society that celebrates diversity, and at least in theory guarantees equality for everybody, regardless of your race or religion or national origin. During World War I, of course, this wartime ideology had been this sort of forced assimilation and Americanization. And this was partly due to pre-existing nativism and the fears that, new immigrants were coming into the country that couldn't be assimilated. By the advent of World War II, that situation had changed. The mobilization of the home front for the war effort causes a lot of population movement around the country, and millions of Americans begin to move out of their ethnically homogenous neighborhoods. They go into the army, they go to work in different war industries around the country. So people are coming into contact with people of all different ethnicities and cultures, and this kind of helps to foster this sort of patriotic assimilation. And this is substantially different from the kind of assimilation that was promoted during the First World War. Now it's the idea that we're all of our different ethnicities and nationalities, we're coming together as Americans for this war effort. Now, of course, this is a rewriting of American history. It's glossing over centuries when American identity gets tied to racial or ethnic status. But it also reflects kind of a new understanding of science. By the 1940s, scientists are coming to understand genetics a little better, and it's becoming clear that race really doesn't mean that much biologically. So while science in the past had been used to justify racist beliefs, now the scientific community is beginning to reject the idea that you can link race or culture with intelligence. So racism, nativism are starting to lose their intellectual respectability. The war doesn't mean that all Americans suddenly become tolerant in the face of this threat from Hitler and the Nazis. Far from it. There's still a lot of bigotry and intolerance that still exists. Jewish Americans, for example, still face considerable anti-Semitism in the United States during the 1940s. This will continue after the war is over. And for people of color, the war doesn't really change all that much, as we're going to see. Probably no group in America experienced more of the intolerance that still plagued the country during World War II than Japanese Americans. The war against Japan was intensely personal for many Americans in the way that the war against Germany simply wasn't. The Japanese, of course, had attacked the United States directly. A lot of Americans feel this need for revenge, feel this kind of intense hatred. But there's also this long standing prejudice against Asians that feeds into the mix here. And the war becomes a racially charged war on both sides of the Pacific. There's Japanese propaganda depicting Americans as lazy, self indulgent, and as weak against the racially pure Japanese. American propaganda very frequently portrays the Japanese as subhuman. And we can see that here in this cover from a popular magazine of the time. A common technique was to liken Japanese soldiers, Japanese generals to animals. And of course, that's undercutting the humanity of your enemy. So, what did all of this mean for thousands of Japanese Americans living in the United States when the war is declared? Most of them were living on the West Coast. Many of them were second generation. They had been born in the United States. They were therefore citizens of the United States. Many spoke very little or no Japanese, had never been to Japan, but they become instantly suspect from almost the minute America enters the war. There's this long history of anti-Asian prejudice, especially on the West Coast, and this just explodes after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And because of this, because of all of this targeting and hysteria from the public, and also on the part of military officials who are, worried that there's going to be some kind of attack, this results in FDR issuing Executive Order 9066, which Roosevelt issues in February of 1942, authorizing the military to remove all people of suspect national origin from their homes and place them in internment camps. The executive order itself, if you look at the text of it, does not specifically target Japanese Americans, but it gives the military the authority to basically target whomever they want. And the military overwhelmingly targets Japanese Americans. So in the spring of 1942, just a few months after the bombing of the Pearl Harbor, more than 100,000 residents of Japanese ancestry were forcefully evicted by the Army from their homes in Washington and Oregon and California and Alaska and sent to nearby assembly centers, and from there sent by train to American-style concentration camps. And most people spent the remainder of the war there. This is a map showing where some of these camps were located. A lot of families wound up spending 3 years living in these facilities. Many had to lose their homes or sell their homes at a great loss. They had to close down their businesses. They had to, and this was, of course, a boon to people who had, had resented Japanese businesses and Japanese farmers, especially in California. They then came in and kind of scooped up all of this land, all of these, sort of businesses. These camps were designed to be kind of self-sufficient. They had their own hospitals, their own schools, post offices, but everything was surrounded by barbed wire. There were guard towers, and people had to eat in, kind of mess halls. They were subject to kind of roll call every morning, this sort of quasi-military discipline. It was a very difficult time for a lot of people, and being targeted just because of your ethnicity or your national heritage was very difficult for a lot of especially second generation Japanese, as this quote from Ayako Hertze Yoshinaga shows. So this is really an example of how the federal government this transformation in the power of the federal government was really used to target a particular group of Americans and to, sort of violate their civil rights. We're going to examine more about Japanese internment this week or next week when we get into looking at the case of Korematsu versus the United States. African Americans also, sort of responded to the war. And the modern civil rights movement really comes out of the experience of African Americans during World War II. One of the first manifestations of this comes even before the United States is officially fighting. In the spring of 1941, the Black labor leader A. Philip Randolph calls for a march on Washington. And he said this march is designed to wake up and shock white America as it had never been shocked before. He argued that he really wanted to get the federal government, particularly Roosevelt, to ensure equality of opportunity in the defense industries and in government agencies. He said, something has to be done, and we need to, sort of mobilize to, sort of make sure that we have equal rights to these jobs and equal rights to these, sort of to these positions. Obviously, a march like this was not going to look very good. And Randolph's plans for a march on Washington scared the Roosevelt administration enough so that FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in defense jobs and established the Federal Employment, the FEPC, the Federal Employment I can't remember what exactly it stands for, but it's basically to monitor compliance of this. This was the first federal agency that had been set up since Reconstruction to work for equal opportunity for Black Americans. So this is, sort of a real kind of sense of African Americans kind of taking matters into their own hands and trying to ensure equality. And one of the things we see is that African Americans begin to embrace this concept of what was called a double V, which meant that victory over Germany and Japan has to be coupled with victory over segregation and racism at home. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans leave the South during the war years in search of jobs in wartime industries and also escaping the pervasive racism of Southern society. But they encountered racial hostility in the North and the West as well. For example, many African Americans from the South came to the city of Detroit. They were coming to the city that was called the Arsenal of Democracy. Detroit has a long, troubled history of race relations. The sort of 200,000 Black residents of the city end up being sort of cramped into this one small neighborhood called Paradise Valley. And the city had not sort of planned to handle all of these new arrivals, and it was a strictly segregated city. And eventually there's all these simmering tensions that come to a boil in June of 1943 when a white mob begins attacking Black neighborhoods. And this riot means that 6,000 federal troops get called in to quell the violence. Detroit is now under armed occupation. The city virtually shuts down, and it amounted to about $2 million in property damage. A number of people were killed during the riot. This is an interesting chart here that I wanted to show just quickly because it shows, this is a chart talking about work stoppages in wartime industries during the war. And as you can see, these are, it's charting strikes in some of these wartime industries where white workers are going on strike because Black workers are being hired to work alongside them on the assembly line, that, sort of some of the people, being, or being promoted are Black workers. So this, I think, is a really interesting chart. It shows that sort of this idea that the American home front was this place of unity where everybody was sort of, unified behind this war effort, that's really not necessarily the case. These, sort of white workers in some of these wartime industries would rather go on strike than have to work alongside people of color, which I think is, fairly interesting. So, at the end of the war, this is a time of joyous celebration, obviously. Americans are very happy that the war is over, and there's a lot that the US has to be happy about. First of all, we had won. We had vanquished the Nazis. We had vanquished the Empire of Japan. The threat that fascism and authoritarian militarism was going to take over the world was ended. America ended the war on top. We are alone among the most powerful nations of the world. We have suffered no major damage from the war. World War II is the deadliest conflict in human history. 60 million people were killed. But U.S. casualties were a very small fraction of that number. Around 418,000 Americans were killed during the war. Most of those were military deaths. That was less than 1% of the total US population. By contrast, around 23.5 million Soviets were killed during World War II. That's about 14% of their total population. Somewhere between 6 to 8 million Germans died in the war. 2 to 3 million Japanese were killed in the war. The U.S. also suffered no major damage to its infrastructure from the war because none of the fighting, aside from Pearl Harbor, had been done on American soil. Most of Europe and Asia, by contrast, are physically devastated. But the U.S. has actually benefited economically from the war. It's clearly the leading world power. But the war has changed a lot about American life. And as we're going to see, peacetime does not usher in this era of international harmony. We're going to be getting into looking at the impact that the Cold War is going to have. And its origins begin, many of its origins begin during World War II. Americans, even though they are sort of very sort of celebratory and very happy that the war is over, there is sort of this anxiety that looms over the future. All right, so that's it for today. For next time, we are going to be looking at chapter 8 in your going to the source text. That is the sort of, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the case of Korematsu versus the United States. So before coming to class on October 23rd, please make sure to read chapter 8 in your going to the source. And I will see you guys all on Wednesday.